Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Manage the Always-On Culture. My name is Caitlin, and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager here at the Myers-Briggs Company. Just to cover some formalities, today's webinar will run for about an hour, and you can submit questions time using the questions function. If we don't manage to answer all of the questions during the webinar or at the end of the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with you directly afterwards. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the slides within the next few days. So for those of you who don't know us as well, as an organization, we have always challenged ourselves to look at how we can impact people's lives through a greater understanding of themselves and others. Our passion really is people. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. John is our head of thought leadership and has been with the Myers-Briggs Company for almost 24 years. John lives and breathes psychometrics and is one of the leading authorities in the application of personality type. John's role is pivotal in keeping the MBTI framework relevant to our ever-changing work environments. And he does this through research like he'll be presenting today. So I will hand it over to you, John.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. So as you've seen, the title of this webcast is How to Manage the Always-On Culture. And you might well ask, why am I talking about the always-on culture? In fact, what actually is the always-on culture? Well, in today's world, with your smartphone in your pocket or by your bedside, you can access information or services at any hour of the day or night. And provided you can get a signal, you can connect with your family or your friends or your work colleagues at the top of a mountain or on a subway train, and they can connect with you. Now, this can be really useful, but there's a downside as well. Because with all of that information, all of those possibilities, it can be really quite difficult to switch off. And that can mean that you never really switch off from work. You are always on. Most people are in several different overlapping teams, quite often teams that are working across different time zones, and they spend a lot of their time working collaboratively. So there's lots of things happening, lots of communication, lots of things to catch up on. And some organizations definitely have an always-on culture. Without necessarily coming right out and saying it, without making it explicit, there's an expectation that you're going to be contactable, you're going to be available, most or even all of the time, even outside your regular working hours. So I'm going to ask you a question now. Does your organization have an always-on culture? You should see a poll have appeared on your screen, and you can answer yes, I'm not sure, or no. So we'll just give you a little while to answer that poll. I'll get a reasonable percent of you to answer it, so up to nearly half of you have answered it. So let's see if we get 3/4 of you. Okay, just give you a few more moments. And I think we'll stop it there. So, you as a group have said that 68% of you, just over 2/3, believe your organization does have an always-on culture. 9% of you aren't sure, and 23% of you, just under a quarter, say no. So bear those results in mind, and as we go through and talk about what the always-on culture is and what it might mean to people, you might want to think how this is going to affect you as individuals and affect other people in your organizations and your teams. Now, previous research has suggested that the always-on culture may not be good for us. If we never switch off, our work can start to interfere with our personal life and how we relate to our family and to our friends. And being always on can be stressful. And also that technology that we use to keep connected, it's really two-sided. It has the potential to empower us and enable us to do new and exciting things, but we may also start to feel like slaves to that technology. The tables may turn and people begin to feel like technology controls them rather than the other way around. Employees can find that technology tethers them, ties them to their work, forces them to be always on, even when they're at home. Now, so far, I've been talking in quite general terms. Let's get a bit more specific. Let's take a snapshot of how you feel about one aspect of the always-on culture. So you can see a new poll has appeared. People shouldn't have to check for emails outside of normal working hours. And what I'd like you to do is to say to what extent you agree with that statement. So again, just give you a few minutes to answer, to put your questions down. And we'll see what you say. Okay, a few more minutes to get a few more of you to vote. Let's make it over 2/3 of you. And I'm going to close the poll in a second. And let's close it there. And let me show you results. So it looks like most of you strongly agree or agree. In fact, 34% of you strongly agree, 48% of you agree. So that's a little over 80%, 82%, as he quit working out quickly, actually agree or strongly agree with that statement. Most of you think that people shouldn't have to check for emails outside of normal working hours. Now, a couple of years ago, we did some research into how our personality influences the way we deal with email. And the same question, people shouldn't have to check for emails outside of normal working hours, was one of the questions that we asked. And this is what we found. In actual fact, you've agreed with that statement even more than this group. For you, I think something like 80%, or just over 80%, strongly agreed or agreed. For this group, it was just under 2/3, just shy of 2/3, 65%. So both for you and for the people in our survey, you all agree that people really shouldn't have to check for emails outside of normal working hours. But of course, this is what people think should be the case. We also asked the people in our survey what they actually did. So for example, we asked, do you check work emails in the evening? Now, in our survey, if 2/3 of people think that you shouldn't have to check your emails outside of normal working hours, you might expect in an ideal world that most people would answer never, or very occasionally, to the second question. But of course, if you look at the numbers, you can see that this wasn't what happened at all. In fact, only a quarter, 25% of the group chose never or very occasionally. And actually just over half, 52%, often, very often, or always check their work emails in the evening. So although most people thought that they shouldn't have to check their emails outside of normal working hours, an awful lot of them did. And you might want to think for yourself how you answered that first question on the left compared with how you would have answered that second question on the right. And of course, it's not just about working in the evening. 48% of our sample often, very often, or always checked work emails for the weekend. 35% did so on holiday, and 21%, and I'm not saying what this does for home life, 21% check for emails late at night or in bed. But what's the effect of being able to access work emails and calls outside of normal working hours? Is it good for you or is it bad for you? We looked into this when we carried out some research last year into the always-on culture. My colleague Nikita compared the response to people who were able to access work emails and calls outside of work with the response to people who were not able to do this. And she did actually find that there were some positive aspects to being always connected. So people who were able to access work emails or other calls outside of work said that they were more engaged and involved with their work, and they're actually more satisfied with their job. They reported higher levels of job satisfaction. But there's also quite a large downside. They also found it more difficult to switch off from work, and this in turn led them to finding their job more stressful and to worries about their job intruding more into their lives outside of work. There was greater work-life interference. And they did report more conflict between work demands and home and family demands. They also engaged in more compulsive checking, repeatedly checking their phones and other devices, which in turn meant that they were more distracted and found it more difficult to focus on things, both inside and also outside of work. And in general, in fact, they reported higher levels of distraction. So overall, remote access to work communication is really a double-edged sword. It has some advantages, but also some really quite significant drawbacks. And one of the things that we're hoping to do in this session is to show you how you can use a knowledge of personality type to really leverage those advantages and manage the disadvantages. So let's look then at how we're aiming to achieve this. Here is the agenda for today's session. So first of all, we're going to look in a bit more detail at the research that we carried out into the always-on culture. We'll talk about the advantages and the disadvantages and about how being always on can have both positive and also negative effects on people. And we'll see how our personality affects how we deal with these. Now, this research we carried out in 2019 in a pre-COVID world. So we're also going to bring in some initial findings from research that we're carrying out right now into personality, remote working, and how this all relates to our reactions to the pandemic. But of course, this research also has a practical side. It's going to be a really useful basis, and has been a really useful basis, for working out strategies to deal effectively with the always-on culture. We'll look at what people do to cope, and show you how you can use the knowledge of personality type to help you, to help your team, to help your organization maximize the advantages of being always on and always connected, and minimize the disadvantages. And finally, we will talk about some of the tools and resources that you could use to help with this process. So let's start off then by looking at the research. What we did was to survey a little over 1,000 people who already knew their personality type, and we asked them questions about how they could connect outside of work, about other behaviors associated with the always-on culture, about the pros and cons of always being connected, the strategies they used to cope, their levels of job satisfaction and work engagement, what their organizations did and did not allow when they came to working outside of working hours, and so on. And we did have quite a wide and varied sample covering a range of jobs and job levels, and with data from the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries as well. And we're going to start off by looking at some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages of that always-on culture. Now remember, the always-on culture means that you can be connected to your workplace 24/7 if, of course, you want to, or if your organization or your clients make you do so. What I'd like you to do now is to take a moment just for yourself to think of one or two advantages that you could see in the always-on culture, and one or two disadvantages. Do feel free to write those down if you like. And I'll just give you a moment to think about what you believe some of the advantages and disadvantages of the always-on culture might be. And what we'll do now then is look at what came out of our survey. Let's look at the possible advantages first. This is what our survey respondents said. So at the top of that chart there, keeping in the loop was mentioned by 17% of our survey respondents. This means really keeping up to date what's happening at work, not missing out on opportunities, as well as being able to act quickly with any issues so they don't escalate. Very close behind, on 16% of our group, quick responses. Being able to provide and receive quick responses especially outside of traditional work hours, whether that's from home or from elsewhere. As we said, this survey was carried out pre-COVID, so actually several people mentioned being able to respond quickly on a commute home, for example. And the third in the top three, mentioned by 13% of the group, flexibility. Flexibility of where and when to work, including being able to work remotely. And if they were able to work remotely, many people in our survey felt that they could be more productive and or that they had better work-life balance. And incidentally, this is a trend that's carried on into the COVID era. In our most recent research, 54% of those who have been essentially forced to work at home because of the COVID pandemic say that actually they're now more productive than they were before. But of course, not everything is positive. And if you look at the bottom of that chart on your screen, you can see that 10% of the group, that's over 100 people, these people said that there were no advantages at all to always-on culture. There were only disadvantages. So let's take a moment to look at those possible disadvantages then. Perhaps remind yourself of what you thought the disadvantages of the always-on culture might be, and then we'll see what our survey respondents said. And if we look at those top three disadvantages, 28% of our respondents said that they couldn't switch off or found it really difficult to do so. For example, they'd be thinking about work when they were at home. They'd always be aware of the work that needed to be done. 26%, almost as many, said that the always-on culture really interfered with their family or their personal life. Their work was really taking over their lives rather than just being one part of their lives. Day to day, they felt they're being interrupted during their family time. They weren't able to be fully present with their children, and were having relationships disrupted, including their relationships with their partners and or with their children. And 20% mentioned mental exhaustion, leading to outcomes like tiredness, stress, mood changes, being irritable, and being less creative. This is hardly a positive picture. And if you compare the numbers, the percentages in the chart on the right with the percentages in the chart on the left, you will see that people were much more likely to mention disadvantages than they were to mention advantages. And although, as we said, 10% of the group said that there were no advantages at all, only 2%, a much smaller number, said that there were no disadvantages to the always-on culture. Now, in my role as head of thought leadership, I spend a lot of my time looking at numbers, but sometimes it's nice to step away from those numbers and see what people actually said. Here's an example of what one respondent saw as the advantages of the always-on culture. I never miss anything. I don't mind working outside of the office because I like to live and breathe what I do. Quite a positive response there. But here's an example disadvantage. You burn out, you have no private life, you've got no time for your children, there's regrets at the end of your life, there's many tense situations, you find yourself losing friends, you find yourself losing close relationships, and there were quite a few comments like this. My colleague Nikita, who is carrying out this analysis, found herself getting quite depressed, in fact, as she was reading through and tabulating these comments. Now, as we said, the data for our always-on research was collected in 2019. And of course, since then, there's been at least one huge change, the advent of COVID. And it's likely that this is increasing the negative impacts of the always-on culture. For example, many more people are now working remotely than ever before. 42% of the United States labor force is now working from home full-time, and they account for more than 2/3 of US economic activity. The pattern is similar in most other developed countries as well. But people who work from home, who do not have that fire break between home and work, are more likely than others to be drawn into the always-on culture. They're also more likely to send emails and other communications odd hours of the day or night because of the flexibility, pulling others into working in an always-on way as well. And of course, a significant proportion of these newly remote workers had no choice, and actually some of them may have preferred to keep working from their previous place of business. In research that we've been carrying out this year, we found that compared with people who were already remote workers before the pandemic, these new remote workers were more likely to miss having people around them, more likely to be looking for a new job, and more likely to wish that they did not have to work from home. The pandemic has also had a severe impact on jobs. A third of the US labour force are not currently employed, and many of those that still do have a job are suffering. In many organisations, there are smaller teams trying to do almost the same amount of work as a much larger team did before. The temptation is to work longer hours, with even further blurring of the boundaries between home and work. People are more stressed, which really doesn't help. And one of the things that we're looking at in our current research is survivor guilt. Some people feel guilty that they still have a job when others have lost theirs, leading to feelings of worthlessness and leaving them even more vulnerable to the negative impacts of an always-on culture to work even harder. And of course, organisations which are struggling, in those organisations there may be additional pressure on people to work in a more always-on way just to keep going until things get better again. Now, before COVID, during COVID, and likely after COVID, it does look as if many people find the always-on culture stressful. But if we know the factors that contribute to that stress, perhaps we could do something about it. And don't forget that avoiding undue stress isn't just important for the individual, it's important for the team and the organisation too. Unchecked stress leads to burnout and to less effective performance. So what we did was to create an overall always-on stress score as a combination of direct job stress, difficulty in switching off, and stress from a conflict between private or family life. And we did find that a whole tranche of factors contributed to this stress. You can see some of them listed here in the blue arrow at the left. So we carried out a regression analysis to identify the most important factors, and what I'll do now is to go through those in order of importance. First of all, organizational culture, and in particular, the extent to which your organization allows you to keep work and home separate. People who work for an organization where they were expected to take work home, to work in their own time and always be connected, perhaps not surprisingly, had considerably high levels of stress. And for many, this wasn't explicitly or officially part of their job, it was just the way we do things around here. The company culture, the tacit acceptance that that's the way things were. Second, employment type. People who worked full-time for an organization were the most stressed, then the self-employed, and with part-time workers showing the lowest levels of always-on stress. Then, personality type. And in particular, whether people had a preference for sensing or for intuition. Some of you will be more familiar with the personality type model, the MBTI model than others, and we'll come back to that in just a short while. Then, job level. People in more senior roles had greater always-on stress. Now that's interesting, because when it comes to work-related stress, generally, often more senior people have lower stress levels, because although they have greater responsibilities, they also have more control over their jobs. So perhaps when it comes to the always-on culture, that control just isn't there to the same extent, and at least to some extent, they're riding the same roller coaster of always-on stress as everybody else is. And at number 5, the number of people in an organization. People working in very small organizations tend to be the least stressed. Then always-on stress builds till you get to about 20 people, after which things level off. Now, for many of these, individuals may be able to not do a great deal about them, but perhaps if they understand their reactions and how that relates to their personality, that might help individuals to develop strategies to deal with always-on stress. So let's go back to number 3, personality type. We're going to see how personality relates to always-on stress and to other aspects of the always-on culture. But before we do that, let's take another poll to check how familiar you are as individuals with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI framework. So you should see a poll now which is asking you how familiar you are with the MBTI framework. And you have different options. You might be an MBTI practitioner, use it often. You might be qualified but have not used it recently. You might have been taken at the MBTI but not be trained to use it. You might have heard of it but not actually had feedback. And some of you might even say, as some of you are saying, what's the MBTI? So let me just give you a short while to complete that poll. And let's wait to see if we get a few more of you to actually do that. And once we get to about 3/4 of you, we'll close the poll and see what you've said. So I'll just give you a few more minutes to vote, or a few more seconds to vote rather. And we're going to close the poll in a second. Let's close it now. Okay, so we have quite a mix of you. 11% are frequent MBTI practitioners, 70% you've qualified it, 52% you've taken it but not trained to use it, another 15% you've heard of it but not had feedback, and 5% of you are saying, what is the MBTI? So with my apologies to those of you who are qualified and do use the instrument frequently, I'm just going to take a short moment to go through the MBTI model and talk through what it's all about. And at its basis, the Myers-Briggs type indicator model looks at 4 aspects of personality. First of all, at extroversion and introversion. How do you redirect and receive energy? If you have preferences for extroversion, you draw your energy and focus your attention on the outside world of people and things. If you have preference for introversion, that energy is focused more on your inner world of thoughts and feelings. Sensing and intuition is about the way you prefer to take in information. And the MBTI really is about your preference for doing things in one way or another. If you have a preference for sensing, you prefer information which is real, which is actual, which is solid, which is based on the evidence of your 5 senses, hence that name sensing. If you have preferences for intuition, you prefer information which is about how things connect together, where things are going, what could be, rather necessarily the facts. Thinking and feeling is about your preference for making decisions. People with a preference for thinking prefer to make decisions on the basis of objective logic. People with a preference for feeling prefer, where they can, to make decisions on the basis of values and on how those decisions will affect people. And judging and perceiving is about how you live your life, how you approach the outside world. People with a judging preference prefer to live their lives in a more organized, structured, planned way. Those with a perceiving preference prefer to live their lives in a more open, spontaneous, unplanned way. So you can have preferences for extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, and judging or perceiving. And if you put both together, that means there are 16 different combinations, 16 possible types. So for example, if someone had a preference for introversion, sensing, thinking, and judging, we'd say they had preferences for ISTJ, the responsible realist. And the essence of the MBTI really is how those 4 pairs of preferences combine together dynamically to say something about you as a whole person. So let's see then how psychological type, how MBTI type relates to different aspects of the always-on culture. We found in our research, for example, that people who have preference for extroversion were more likely to have a work smartphone and laptop than people with preference for introversion. That people who have preference for sensing and people with preference for judging had a greater desire than people with preference for intuition or for perceiving to keep work and home separate, which is something that can be difficult to do in the context of the always-on culture. People with a preference for judging are more likely to have a work smartphone, but those with a preference for perceiving, and also more likely to have higher job-related stress. And people with a preference for sensing are more likely to have greater overall always-on stress, as we saw in our previous slide, than people with a preference for intuition, and also to have lower levels of job satisfaction. Now, when we did research, we found that some people didn't feel they were part of the always-on culture at all. They were, in fact, swimming in those waters. They didn't notice the always-on culture because it was the way they liked to be. And all of those people had preferences for intuition and perceiving. So if you have preference for intuition and or perceiving, you're less likely to feel that you're affected by this always-on culture. Let's summarize what we've covered so far then and what research is telling us. We've seen, first of all, that always-on culture is very much a double-edged sword. It has some advantages, like being able to keep in the loop, like getting quick answers and being flexible, but also very significant disadvantages, like not being able to switch off, interference with personal lives, and even mental exhaustion. But the problem is that for most people, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, or beg your pardon, the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. And also, of course, the COVID pandemic does seem to be making things worse. If we look at the stress that the always-on culture causes, the top 5 contributors are first, organizational culture, the way that things like working extra hours are treated. Then whether people are working full-time, part-time, or self-employed. Then having a preference for sensing rather than for intuition, their job level, and also the number of people in the organization. And as we've seen, personality has other effects as well. For example, people with preferences for intuition and perceiving often don't feel they are always on at all. So that's the situation. That's what came out of research. But the important question is, what can we do about this? What strategies can we put in place to help ourselves, to help our clients, our teams, our organizations? And for you as individuals, what do you do to help with your always-on culture? For those of you who feel you are in that area, and perhaps what should you do? What would actually help? Now, this is probably not the best strategy to use. It's not a very adaptive strategy. Let me give you some more realistic options, and let's see which of these you might be more likely to use to cope with the always-on structure, always-on culture. So, which of these options would you choose? Would you be more likely to do something which involves activity? To do something away from your always-on culture, take a holiday, absorb yourself in other activities, make sure you look after your health. Would you perhaps avoid using technology? You turn off your devices, you leave your devices somewhere you can't get at. You don't accept work smartphones and other work-dedicated devices. Do you really just make sure you're very aware of how you use technology and make really careful and mindful choices about how you use it? Do you be quite clear and strict about how and when you communicate with others? Doing things like letting people know your availability, letting people know that you won't communicate outside those times and only really responding to important issues? Or do you really make an effort to keep work and home life separate? Do things like time boxing, this time's for home, this time's for work, and I'm making a really strong effort to keep those things separate. Let me just give you a few more moments to complete that survey. I can see that a little over half of you have voted, so we'll just give you a few more moments to see what you come up with. We'll close the poll in 1 second. And let's close it now. So, slightly ahead of the pack, activities, 36% of you, a little over a third, say that you'd do something away from your always-on culture. Then, being very aware of how you use technology, spent keeping work and home separate, 5% of you just avoiding using technology, and 5% of you really drawing those boundaries. Now, we asked our respondents to the survey what they did. They were open-ended questions, but their answers fitted into the same categories as we had in that poll. And perhaps the single most used category was just to avoid technology use, to turn off your devices, to leave your device somewhere else, for example. One respondent said that what they did was to take their work smartphone and put it in the fridge, because then they just wouldn't hear it call. Make an effort not to check your devices, making sure they didn't accept a work smartphone, all of those activities. Then, making a real conscious effort to keep work and home life separate. Doing our thing about time boxing, making very clear distinctions between work and home. Making sure that you knew those boundaries for yourself and sticking to those boundaries. Perhaps having separate devices for work and home, and for people who were working as independent consultants, actually taking care about who they worked for, so when pushed into a place, they would have to act in an always-on way. Communicating with others, making it clear when people are available, setting boundaries, making an effort not to respond to communications, only very important communications outside of normal working hours. Interestingly, absorbing activities was one of the less mentioned options for our people in our survey, and your most frequently answered option for you. And last but not least, being aware of or quite choiceful about technology use. Now, one thing we found was that people with different personality types actually use different strategies, and that some strategies were more effective than others. We found that different aspects of the always-on culture required different strategies. So, for example, to make it easier to switch off, we found that people who turn off the devices, didn't check a phone and set those boundaries, found it much easier to switch off than those people who didn't do that. To minimize work-family conflict, the most important factor was just not checking their phones when they were at home. To minimize job stress, again, setting boundaries, only responding to work emails is important, and setting boundaries with others. And it really is that separation of work and home that seemed to make the difference for job stress, which I think relates to the fact that people who had a sensing preference found that less easy to do. And finally, to increase work engagement, people who use that time boxing technique and were quite careful and choiceful and mindful about when they did and did not use technology and what technology they used, those people showed higher levels of work engagement than those who did not. We found also that there were personality differences in who used different strategies. So, for example, if we think about taking part in absorbing activities, those were more adopted by people who had preference for extroversion, setting boundaries with others, and also turning off mobile phones and other devices were particularly adopted by people with a preference for intuition. And only sending emails during business hours was more likely to be adopted by people with a thinking preference. Of course, those are the strategies that people with different type preferences adopted. What this isn't saying is anything about the extent to which those strategies were more or less effective. And sometimes your personality type might just work in a way that just helps you cope with the always-on culture. So, for example, when we did research a couple of years ago to type an email, we expected that people with an introversion preference would be more stressed by receiving emails than people with an extroversion preference. Introversion, after all, is about that focus on your inner world of thoughts and feelings, and not necessarily wanting those interruptions from the outside. In fact, we found that wasn't the case. There's actually no significant difference between people with an extroversion preference and introversion preference in the extent to which they are stressed by email. But then we noticed a different difference that might account for this. On average, extroverts sent more emails than introverts did, and therefore received more emails as well. So maybe people with a preference for introversion are less stressed than you might think by email because on average, they just don't send so many. Maybe they have, in effect, adopted a strategy that reduces email stress. And this does seem to be the case. For people who don't receive large numbers of emails every day, there isn't a difference between extroverts and introverts. But as the number of emails increases, people with a preference for introversion become significantly more stressed than extroverts. So for those people who have an introversion preference but do receive quite a few emails, they're more stressed than extroverts, but many introverts manage their emails so they receive less emails, so they're less stressed. So that's something which sort of happens automatically. But if you know your personality type, you can actively choose to adopt a strategy that's effective for you and help others to use strategies that are effective for them. So for example, depending on your preference for extroversion or introversion, you can choose an effective way to give you the time and space to switch off. If you have a preference for extroversion, you might prefer doing something active, ideally with others. Now that could be difficult at the moment. And in our current research, we found, for example, that extroverts are significantly more concerned about maintaining their exercise program than introverts are. But online social activities or other ways to spend time, even virtual time with others, should help you to take your mind off work. I know, for example, someone who started an online book club. And maybe for people with extroversion preferences, this is a good time to try new and different hobbies to help keep you interested and involved. And if you have a preference for introversion, you might prefer doing something that allows you to reflect or concentrate without interruptions, and you might have depth of interests. So you might find that the most effective way to switch off from the always-on culture is to really absorb yourself in one of your favorite hobbies. So you might, for example, enjoy exercising individually or getting really stuck into a good book. And it might be an idea to have an activity ready to go to help you to switch off more quickly from work. You can use your knowledge of sensing and intuition to avoid information overload. If you've got a preference for sensing, you might sometimes overdo your own preference, become too caught up in the details and the now of what's going on, just reacting to new information that's coming in all the time. It might be really helpful just to stop, take a step back, and look at the big picture. And that should help you to focus your attention on what's most important and pull you away from a hamster wheel of continual reacting. Whereas if you've got a preference for intuition, you might overdo your own preference by getting caught up in research and discussing new possibilities and options. Work remotely on your own, sometimes it's really easy to get drawn down that sort of rabbit hole. So again, stop, step back, think about what's happening in the present moment, and focus about doing one thing at a time. Knowing whether you've got a thinking preference or a feeling preference should help you to set boundaries. If you have a thinking preference, remember to consider not only whether being always on is going to aid productivity in the task you're involved in, but also the impact that things are going to have on others. For example, only send emails during business hours unless things are really urgent, even if perhaps this means writing the email and then delaying sending it or keying it to send later. This is going to reduce the pressure that others may feel, perhaps especially people with a feeling preference, to respond straight away. If you have a feeling preference, ask yourself whether your response is really important for the task at hand and whether responding quickly to somebody really is a priority. By stepping back and trying to look at things in a logical way, you may be able to find a balance between being supportive of others while still ensuring you look after yourself and you have the space to rest and take time out at home. And judging and perceiving, and your knowledge of judging and perceiving, can help you to find a work-life balance that works for you. If you have a judging preference, you're likely to prefer some degree of separation between your work and home lives in order to get the most out of time you have at work at home. Think, as we've already said, about setting boundaries with yourself about when you will and will not use technology to allow yourself to fully switch off from work when you're at home. You might take the advice of that person who put their phone in the fridge, otherwise leave your phone somewhere that isn't going to distract you, or turn off notifications to help you to do this. And if work doesn't let you allow to do this, or let you do this completely, try to compromise. For example, let your colleagues know a particular time of the weekend that you respond, but not at other times. If you have a perceiving preference, you might really value the freedom and flexibility that the always-on culture brings, and you may not actually ever feel as if you're always on. Do enjoy that sensation, enjoy being able to work from home or where and how the inspiration takes you, but don't expect others to do the same. Respect other people's boundaries, and if you do need a quick response to an urgent matter outside of work hours, agree beforehand on a way to let your colleagues know so you're all working on the same page. Also, although you might like being responsive, remember to make time for the other activities you might enjoy, especially ones that give you something you don't get from work, because those other activities also make up really an important part of your life, and you shouldn't allow the always-on culture, even if you're not feeling that particular pressure, to take over your life. But of course, some things are important for everybody, although the way we might go about these might depend on our personality. And I think really there's three key principles. I'll say that again in the way that actually works. 3 key principles for individuals and for organizations in the always-on culture. First of all, switch off. As an individual, find ways in which you can mentally switch off from work, from emails, from social media, from technology, so you have that break on a regular basis. But it's also important that organizations allow people to do this. And if you're able to cultivate a workplace culture that does allow people to switch off from work in their free time, you will mitigate some of those negative effects of the always-on culture, and people will be much less likely to suffer from burnout, and actually you'll get more out of the people in your organization. And to help with that, it's important to set boundaries. So for you as an individual, think about setting boundaries on the way you use technology to avoid yourself getting drawn into those unhelpful, even unhealthy habits. And for organizations, think about this and set those clear expectations about how technology is going to be used both inside and outside of work. And stick to those expectations. Don't have one written rule and the other unwritten rules is what you really do in your organizations. And let people know about this stuff. You as an individual, make sure people know when you're available, when you're not available, set those boundaries with others. And for organizations, communicate those expectations, but also, really importantly, ensure that the leaders in your organization role model that behavior. Role model of behavior you might expect from not an always-on culture, but a sometimes off culture. And if there's one single thing that organizations can do, I think, to mitigate the effects of the always-on culture, is to ensure that their leaders do role model that behavior. That their leaders don't expect people to respond in the middle of the night, and don't make it clear that because they are working all the hours that are sent, other people should as well. Now, we've talked here about the individual and their organization, but of course there's a level between those two, the team. And sometimes the always-on pressure comes from the team, so these principles are really important for teams as well. So what does switch off, for example, mean for teams? I think it's really worthwhile thinking about what impact it would have on the team if people took the time to switch off from technology. How would other people in the team see that? Would it impact on working relationships, or levels of trust, or levels of stress, or people's performance. And it may be that that's a really sort of thing to have a conversation about in your team, including perhaps what could be put in place to help people to switch off from technology sometimes. For example, are people being rewarded just for being online? Or you do the electronic equivalent of rewarding people for being in the office or having the jacket on the back of their chair in the office without actually looking at performance? And if you do have those conversations, it's probably going to lead to a discussion about setting boundaries. Just what, for example, is a team culture about using technology both inside and outside work, and what's the organizational culture? So, for example, even if you want to set boundaries at team level, do people feel that the organization expects them to respond to emails and calls even in free time? And if there is a mismatch, what can you do about it? Who can you talk to? And of course, you can then use all this information to hopefully agree on some guidelines for the team. And as is so often the case, communication is key. Think carefully about what you do and about how others might see this or be affected by this. Think about what you know of as a team, and maybe you set up a discussion and talk these through. As we've seen, what you like and want may not be the same as what someone else in your team likes and wants, especially if they have different personality type preferences. Let's finish off in our last few minutes by looking at some of the steps that you might want to take following this webinar and some of the resources that you might draw on. So, Caitlin, back over to you.
Thanks, John. So just to start off with, John has presented some really interesting information about the always-on culture and the impact that it can have on us as individuals as well as on our teams within organizations. And as team leaders, it's really important to note that the key strategies that John just talked about are enhanced with the knowledge of the MBTI. So it's pretty important to, if you can, actually learn the preferences of the people in your team and in your organization. And we have a few ways that we can help you do that. And so the first one is MBTI online teams, and that's going to be self-directed and virtual, a really great team solution that is quick and easy to get started with right away. The next option that we have is for facilitated instructor-led virtual team building, where you will get MBTI preferences and reports for the team, and that is our MBTI Insights virtual workshop. And our last option is to certify a team building expert within your organization. And you can do that through the MBTI certification process, where then someone can be in charge of facilitating these things within the organization for as many teams as you would like. So every situation and organization is unique, and we know that as the experts in people development, we'd love to partner with you and help you and your organization tackle the always-on culture in your specific ways. So it looks like we have time for maybe one or two questions. So John, the first question that we got was, if as a team leader, how should you start this process of transforming away from the always-on culture and using some of those key principles that you mentioned?
I think there's two routes, and those two routes could go in parallel. We talked, we had, you'll get some copies of the slides you can refer to afterwards. We talked about those general three key principles, and I think that's a really good initial roadmap to take. But above that, I think a lot of this really depends on self-awareness, on people knowing themselves, knowing their personality, and really that's why things like the MBTI can be really useful. So if people already know their personality type, I think that's a really great starting place. If they don't know their personality type, and some of those routes that Caitlin was talking about just a moment ago, I think are really good starting places, because there are things which apply to everybody, those three key principles, but there are also some things that are unique to you as a unique individual, and how you as an individual will cope with the always-on team. And I think that's really important to remember, and really important as a team leader to remember that, and it's an obvious thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, not everybody is the same as you, and people are going to react to your culture in different ways to you did. One of the things we're going to make available for you afterwards is a tip sheet with some more detailed tips on how you might go about this in your own teams.
Awesome. And one more question we got was, how do introverts and extroverts respond differently to the always-on culture? Were you able to see any really clear differences between those two preference types?
We did talk a little bit about those before. Actually, extroversion-introversion is a less crucial part of the always-on culture, I think, than things like sensing intuition, things like judging, perceiving. Those were the biggest differences in how people coped or didn't cope with the always-on culture, especially, as we've already said, sensing and intuition. And again, we're seeing some work recently where we're looking recently at research into things like remote working, and the way that people are and aren't immersed in the always-on culture in this COVID situation, COVID pandemic. And actually, both people with an extroversion and an introversion preference seem to be generally coping reasonably well with that remote working, always-on type approach. But there are differences. So extroverts are missing people. Introverts are sometimes find themselves with too many meetings, online meetings and emails and things going on. But generally, it's not that extroverts prosper, introverts don't, or vice versa. Each type has different advantages and disadvantages when it comes to your culture and when it comes to our current situation.
Great. So it looks like that's all the questions that we have time for today. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us again. And just to reiterate, we will be sending this information out to you so that you can review it later. And thank you so much. Good luck and stay safe out there, everyone.
Thank you.